of the whole meeting along with the Historic Preservation Commission. This is a joint meeting being held on Tuesday, October 19th, 2021.
Roll call.
Yeah, roll call vote.
Trustee Postuma,
Here.
Trustee Burns,
Here.
Trustee Benke.
Here.
Chairman Stifler,
Here.
and Commissioner Prisby,
Here.
and Chairman Bonin.
Here.
Thank you.
Before I turn it over to Bethany tonight, I just want to highlight a few things to the commissioners and to the trustees. First of all, I want to commend Bethany for putting together a very good summary on specifically noting for individuals the meetings that we've had since May 4th, which is on the first page of the memorandum. Bethany does a great job of summarizing what we've discussed as far as historic preservation to date. I'm going to turn it over to her, and she's going to do a summary. And what I really want, what I think we need to think about is we've outlined kind of parameters of where we would give relief or incentives. We need to start thinking about what dollar amount and what percent or type of relief we're going to give. I mean, we've batted some numbers around here and there, but I think we're at a point now where we need to, begin having conversations, think about the budget and building of that thing. So with that, Bethany, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. So this was the draft in here was our first stab at trying to get a historic overlay district together to be able to provide some of these incentives, not just to properties within our current historic districts, but we've also talked about there's a lot of important buildings scattered throughout the village. So this was our first attempt at putting together some regulations. So there's still a lot of work to be done, but we're looking for some initial feedback and to make sure that we're on the moving in the right direction. This is kind of the culmination of months of kind of talking and seeing how this is organically evolving here. And so what we're hoping to do, and I'll kind of start off and give an overview, and then I'll throw it to our village attorney, Michael Mars, who can kind of go into some of the additional details. But we are hoping to establish this through the Historic Overlay District. And there is a process that will be established for creating that district, which we're hoping that the Historic Preservation Commission will help us identify what these properties are going to be. And then based on that and all the months of talking that we've had, we have different types of incentives ranging from building permit fees, property tax rebates, and zoning relief for single-family residential properties. So there's a lot of work we can do to try to hone in on some of these details, but for now I'll throw it over to Michael Mars to go over the actual draft that we've put together so far.
And actually, before Michael, before you get started, are there any questions from trustees or commissioners at this point before we get into this? Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks. As Bethany said, we have more work to do, but we wanted to give you, what we had so far as an update to get feedback, make sure we're on the right track. So remember, the purpose here is set forth in the very first section of the draft ordinance is to incentivize preservation and historically appropriate improvements to properties we want to see preserved within the village. So that's kind of like the goal. And I'll briefly take you through the steps as set forth in create this ordinance, and then how it's going to work. So step one, as she said and I said, we have more work to do. We want to bring it back with additional items addressed, including adding some definitions, because there's a lot of terms in here that are used repeatedly. We want to make sure we have solid definitions of those. And some cross-references in other places of the code, including your existing historic preservation chapter and in appropriate places elsewhere in the zoning code. So at some point then, after everyone's comfortable with how this reads overall, we're going to hold a public hearing at the Plan Commission on this text, and they'll make a recommendation to the board. Once the board approves it, this text that you see here will go into your zoning code. All right? And that creates like the skeleton of how this is all going to work. The next step after that is actually determining the boundaries of the historic overlay district itself. So you're going to approve this text prior to determining those boundaries. The boundaries are addressed at section 8202. We'll talk more about that at future meetings, but we wanted to generally include all the areas of the village where we think there's historically significant homes that we want to make eligible for these various incentives. So it may end up being all the residential districts, maybe parts of some of the residential zoning districts. We have a lot of flexibility there, and possibly at least the downtown commercial historic district. But again, that's a discussion for further down the line. You don't need to get into that today. And just as a reminder, I know I came a couple months ago and talked about what a historic overlay district is, but it's a specialized district and actually lays on top of your other zoning district or parts of your other zoning districts on your zoning map. So you decide where those boundaries are. And the idea of this ordinance is if you have what's determined to be a historically significant structure and it's within that overlay district, it becomes eligible for these incentives that are described in the ordinance and that Bethany's gone over with you guys. And those incentives include certain bulk regulation standards that are different and more generous than those of the underlying zoning districts. So besides the general boundaries of the district, the mechanism for determining what properties within those boundaries are going to be eligible for incentives is kind of the next part, and that's what section 8204 is all about. The HPC, if they're not already, is going to be working on creating a list of what they propose to be these historically significant properties in the village, whose property owners will be eligible for these incentives, and the structures within the village that we're most interested in seeing preserved. So the language before you will have already been put in place while that list is worked on. But once they have that list, which we call within this ordinance the initial list, there'll be another public hearing specific to both the boundaries of the district and the specific houses on that initial list. And so that's going to be the biggest step. The approval of that list will be treated as another text amendment to your zoning code, because we're going to take that list and put it in the zoning code as an appendix. And again, that's that list of historically significant properties within the overlay district that will be eligible for these incentives.
And I'm sorry to interrupt, but right now, for a resident, if their home, appears on that list, there's absolutely nothing detrimental. There's no type of restrictive covenant or anything.
Correct. So we've kept this all very positive. It's all incentives. And in addition, these incentives are completely optional. We make that clear in the ordinance that I can have a house and it could be placed on this list even if I don't consent, but that doesn't mean anything unless I, as the property owner, want to utilize these incentives and affirmatively come to the village and seek those.
Thank you.
So again, when we have that hearing on the initial list, that's going to be the big one. And because that's a text amendment, it's affecting these specific properties, there's going to be a lot of notice involved in that particular hearing or series of hearings, because we're going to want to notify the property owners as well as their neighbors, because this is their chance to come out and say, I'm not comfortable with having that particular house be deemed historically significant and eligible for these relaxed setbacks because I'm concerned about my sight lines or whatever else. Because later on, if that homeowner, once they make it onto the list, comes affirmatively with an application, they're already eligible for those setbacks so long as the other criteria for their addition or whatever they're doing are met. So that initial creation of the initial list is really when the opportunity for public comment from adjacent neighbors comes in. And I propose that, as we go forward, we maybe have a workshop meeting to familiarize the public with what's being proposed, where they can ask questions and we can have more of an informal discussion about how this all works. You might even break the list into, I don't know how many houses will end up being on there, but you could have multiple hearings so they're in manageable groups. And it's hard to say, because this is all positive incentives, how much of the public is really going to come out and present public input, and I don't think we'll know that until we get a little further down the line.
Michael, if I may. So I understand now your reason for giving notice and everything, but let's say that there's a house that we feel is significant and should be on the list. And for whatever reasons, neighbors on both sides of that house come and they say, we don't want it to be on that list. are you suggesting that the neighbors could stop that house from being put in the overlay district?
No.
And take away the rights of the person that lives in that house?
Nope, no, that's a decision for the HPC in the recommendation and for the board to make.
So that point,
And you're
it goes to
really
hearings,
looking,
there's objection.
you're really looking at the historic significance as opposed to those objections, but we do want to give that opportunity for somebody to provide input. And maybe their input would be more relevant if it went to, I don't believe this is, historically significant or meets the other criteria.
Well, they could be concerned, like you said, on setbacks or something.
Yep,
And how it might negatively affect them.
yep.
But not knowing what the homeowner in the significant house
Right,
might
they
have in
don't
mind.
know at that
It's
point
purely,
what they might do or when they might do it or if they'll ever do anything.
correct.
But we have to provide an opportunity for public comment just because it's statutorily required,
Okay.
okay? And rather than have that input happen when somebody comes forward with an application. So the idea is, once you're on the list, we want it to be an easy, streamlined process where somebody's coming in, here's the alteration I want to make to this house, and I'll talk about that process in a minute, but essentially the HPC is going to review it in conformance with the Department of Interior standards and sign off on it. And so long as it meets all the criteria in our ordinance, there's not going to be a big public hearing and a lot of process on the back end.
Well, what you're saying is, in the initial stages here, if the neighbors on either side of this house didn't raise a question at this stage in the front end, then they've lost their right to make an issue on the back end?
Well, they're still welcome to come to the public
True.
meeting where the HPC discusses the actual application, because we're having that discussion at a public meeting. We're not doing it administratively. But we're not going to be sending out notices within 250 feet and things like that. We're just looking at, here's the application, here's
Right.
the applicant, and we're going to give this a thumbs up or thumbs down.
But this, so we've channeled this process to the HPC and the board. In other words, the ZBA or a body such as that would not have any purview over this at a later date.
Right, so let's say there's a house that's significant, historically significant next to one that's not.
Yes.
Okay, so the one that's on the list is eligible for these more generous setbacks.
Yes.
Again, because we're trying to incentivize them keeping the house as opposed to demoing it. That person can utilize those more generous setbacks through this process without going to ZBA, whereas if their neighbor wanted to use that same setback, they would need a variation
Yes.
from the ZBA. So that's one of the incentives.
So we're trying to head this off on the front end,
Yep.
essentially.
Yeah, we're trying to front load the process so that we're able to streamline it for the individuals when they're seeking these incentives later.
And the fact that once someone's in the overlay district, that the setback would be unsightly or something like that, that's no longer a grounds for objection at that point. They could come to the meeting and sort of raise their hand about it.
Well, one of the criteria we did put in here, in addition to those standards from the Department of Interior, when you're looking at changes to historic buildings, is there going to be an adverse effect on the neighbors? So you are going to look at that aspect of it. And the one example that we called out in here has to do with stormwater, right?
Yep.
We don't want something, just because we're giving you these more generous setbacks, we don't want to create a stormwater issue. We're going to want to look at those kind of things. But the main focus is going to be on whether it's historically appropriate. But we still have built in that aspect of looking at the effect on the neighbors.
And engineering and building permits would still be required. And this doesn't completely get rid of a variation process. Someone is in a historic building is trying to build on the lot line, it's still gonna trigger a variation. It's not like all the zoning laws
Right,
are
we're not letting
out-
it go right up to
out the door, so.
But I think, like, the main idea is, one of the main ideas that we kind of envisioned at the outset of this is, we're most concerned about the front of the houses, the facades, the parts we can see. And so to the extent that we can incentivize keeping that house up, but putting maybe a larger addition on the back into a rear yard setback where you wouldn't otherwise maybe be eligible for a variation or whatever, in order to make the house usable from
Right.
from the interior standpoint, that seems like a good incentive to
And
get.
that's the typical situation, as we said in previous meetings, where these older homes don't have a family room off the kitchen.
Yep.
So the kitchen's usually in the rear, so if we can
Yep.
use a little more of the rear yard.
And if we can do that, and still keep the facade exactly how we want it to
Yeah.
look.
And the odds are going out the back, aside from stormwater and things that would come under the engineering studies, but the odds are that visually going out the back is not going to hurt the neighbors on either side,
Yep.
unless windows don't match up or something. Yeah.
Right, and one of the aspects that we put in here is they have to turn in plans, and you're gonna look at those, and so if a neighbor is concerned how it looks, that's something that you can take into account maybe in terms
Right.
of the stylistic aspects of it.
Okay.
Okay?
And just as we have this discussion, I think it's important to remember as we started these discussions, many months ago, we talked about historic preservation, and historic preservation was generally looked upon favorably from most people within the village, but it was only a select few that burdened the cost of historic preservation. It was basically those people that owned older homes. And by relaxing certain zoning requirements, it really spreads that responsibility of historic preservation across a greater portion of the community. I just wanted to add that because I think it's important of how we got here.
I agree.
So, going on, once we've created this list through this public hearing process, there is an opportunity if an individual feels they were overlooked and wants to seek eligibility, they can bring forward an individual application related to their house, or if the board feels like one was overlooked and they want to bring that forward, they can. There's also a process for removal too. In the event a structure on the list is demolished, it would be automatically removed from the list. Or if it somehow otherwise loses the characteristics that made it historically significant. So if somebody said, I don't care about these incentives, I'm gonna, paint it orange and put on, aluminum siding, we would say, well, it looks like we're gonna take you off the list at that point. So what I've talked about so far are really the big steps, and they're all on the front end. Once you have the boundaries established, the approved group of historically significant properties, you'll then only likely be dealing with these individual owners when they seek an incentive. And those incentives are listed in 8205. They're all the things that we've discussed before. Fee waivers for zoning and building permits, expedited process, property tax rebates, grants or matching funds, and relaxed bulk standards. And the last piece I wanted to talk about is section 8206, which is the process a property owner already on the list goes through in order to utilize an incentive. So if they want to utilize one of these incentives, they have to put an application in and obtain what we're calling an incentive approval certificate, which is kind of this ordinance's version of a certificate of appropriateness. It's basically the HPC reviewing and signing off on your plans, whether it's rehab work on the front or a rear addition, to be eligible. And in addition, we say you can't owe any delinquent property taxes or have other fines or fees that you owe to the village at the time you make your application. So the plans are reviewed by HPC at a public meeting, not a public hearing, using the Department of Interior's recommended standards. Those are at the bottom half of page 8 and top of page 9. And so long as those standards are met, along with the village code requirements, and the HPC finds the addition is not going to have, or alteration is not going to have an adverse effect on these adjacent properties, the certificate is approved. And they're the final authority on the issuance of these certificates, and enable you to utilize these incentives, except in cases where financial assistance in the form of grants or rebates are involved, in which case it's going to move on to the village board, because we want the village board to have that authority over use of public funds, and in how that package is going to be put together, how many years the tax rebate is approved for, what kind of facade improvement matching funds we're going to provide, et cetera. In the case of any incentive, the property owner is going to enter into a program agreement that we're going to develop and bring to you at one of these future meetings that will bind them to certain requirements. So there'll be more detail than what you're seeing in the ordinance as to how they utilize these incentives and how they have to keep up their end of the bargain. But you're going to approve those agreements, these form agreements that we can use for each of these incentives as we move through the process. And then the last piece is the financial incentives are going to be funded through a historic preservation fund to be created in the village, funded by the village board along with donations through fundraising, et cetera. And that's a piece that's existed since the President Colley draft that we first developed last year. And we actually put the code provisions regarding that fund in your existing Title 14 on preservation so that it can be used not just for these kind of incentives, but also for broader preservation purposes too. So that's the quick overview. I know it's a lot to digest, but we're happy to answer any questions. And Bethany, I don't know if you want to add anything.
The only couple things I'll add, that was a pretty good summary so far, but the things that to keep in mind moving forward is to reiterate the zoning relief right now is only put together for single-family residential zoning districts, so the R1, R2, R3, R4 districts. So that was a lot more oriented towards the single-family homes and some of the demolitions that we've been seeing in Robbins Park and other places in the village. But the one thing to keep in mind that we'd also like some feedback from the board and the Historic Preservation Commission is, should all of these incentives be open to every land use in every zoning district? For example, do we want to offer property tax rebates to a downtown building, or do we want that just for a single family home? These are the kind of things that we kind of want some feedback on, because the financial aspects of that to the village are going to be different for estimating purposes. And then like Michael was saying, you know, what does the village board and the HPC feel about like the appropriate grant amounts, and as we move forward with putting these program details, do we want to have caps on things, and what's the appropriate funding that might be available for, you know, the first year of a program like this?
And Bethany, along those lines, can you walk through, you know, how those grant and matching funds would work? My initial thoughts is the village would put money aside for that for a specific year, and it would be capped at that amount?
Yes, so that's one way. I mean, building permit fee waivers, we don't need to put money aside technically for that. We'd obviously want to track it and estimate how much we're putting into each year so that we can learn from this program. But the waivers are a little bit separate. For a property tax rebate or for a grant, we're envisioning that someone would submit an application, and it would be somehow tied to some exterior work that they're doing. Then we would route that to the HPC for, you know, a recommendation, make sure that they're meeting those preservation standards, and then something like that would go to the village board for final approval because it's a substantial amount of public funds. And then if it was approved by the board, we would have some sort of agreement signed, just like an ordinance or a development agreement, that then they'd be required to meet those. And so there is an ability to have every project tweaked a little bit. If there's one where, you know, I guess the village board wanted to go above and beyond a certain cap, I suppose they could, but we kind of want to have some program guidelines, I think, set out.
And on an annual basis, if those funds aren't used, do they stay into the program to be used at a later date?
That's something we can talk about. I know in a village I previously worked for, if those type of funds weren't used, the village actually can create their own initiatives. So if we wanted to do historic signage, for example, and we knew we were going to have money left over, or we know there's this one building that we want to do a historic survey for, or we want to hire a consultant to do some sort of preservation plan, or these type of preservation related projects, we made the Historic Preservation Fund pretty open and broad for preservation purposes, that we can be flexible if there is money left over.
Trustee Stifler, as part of the annual budget process, we would go through and we would set aside a certain amount of money. We'll put it in a line item and have certain requirements to use those funds. In the event that we didn't expend all those funds for the year, the board then can make the choice to do these other projects or have it roll over to the next year, because at the end of the day, if we don't spend the money, it goes to the reserve.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Well, I have the opposite question. Let's say, for example, there's a global pandemic and we have huge revenue shortfalls. Can we I mean, is it a true fund where the money is set aside, or can we?
No, you're using the term fund, it would be a line item in the budget, and it would be part of the general fund. And that is one of the things that we would look at as discretionary spending. So if we had another pandemic or a downturn in the economy worse than we've seen before, and we stopped discretionary spending, that would be something we would have to put on hold, unless, of course, the board thought that that was paramount to continue.
So it's no different than like the capital improvement?
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. Right, so nobody has a vested right to these funds. They have to apply, and it's discretionary to the board. Do we like this particular project enough to match what they're putting in up to a certain amount, et cetera?
I had a question on the earlier part. I guess maybe this is a question for you guys, because you're gonna be coming up with a list. So are we gonna put the whole, maybe you haven't thought about this yet, like the whole Robbins Park Historic District into this overlay? Because there obviously there's a lot of historic homes there, but then there are other homes which aren't. I was just thinking, is there a chance that like a home that actually really isn't historic somehow gets wrapped into this?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so the boundaries, the actual boundaries of the overlay district are going to be set so that they capture the universe of historically significant homes, but that doesn't mean that all the homes within those boundaries are eligible. The boundaries are just something that is necessary from a zoning standpoint so we can see where this is on a map. But within that district, once it's created, once the boundaries are established, the only people eligible for the incentives are the ones that are on this historically significant structures property list as determined by the HPC and approved by the board. So if there's homes within the Robbins district that are non-contributing and aren't decided to be historically significant, they are not eligible for any of these incentives. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, that's gonna be a lot of work for you guys, but.
It's probably gonna be easier to eliminate houses in the Robbins district rather than count all the qualifying ones.
Right.
And then other sections of the town, we'd have to go block by block.
And one of the things that Michael did mention earlier that we're kind of foreseeing is that, and we can talk about what that process is gonna look like, but I believe there's probably gonna be needing to be several public hearings. We can take chunks of addresses or chunks of things at a time, because like this is laid out, we'll have to notify the property owners and everyone within 250 feet of them. So we're probably gonna have to break it up versus the entire village being at one public hearing.
One would hope that we don't create a massive audience at some point where
Right.
we lose control of
Right.
the notion of the meeting.
Now, I don't really have I think when we had initial discussions, I heard numbers in the, 100 houses that people thought were fairly significant or maybe more, but do you have any kind of sense of how many houses we might be?
I honestly don't. I suspect there's certainly 50 or more in the Robbins district.
Yeah, okay.
So I would have to think there's as many in the other areas too, certainly.
So we compiled a list of properties in Hinsdale that touched either the first two surveys, they were in the Mary Sterling book, the map that we got from HPC, and compiled a list. And I think we came up with probably 150-ish
Something like
that we had sent out as kind of maybe a good starting point,
Right.
just for
Exactly.
context.
I think that our initial criterion is probably 50 years or older, right?
It's the initial criteria.
Yeah, and that's something that, those prior surveys don't necessarily take into account. So my guess is that we're going to be adding some structures based on when those were done, Rob, but,
Because it's a rolling entry based on 50 years.
right, every
is the
year we
process.
have new houses that are eligible.
Sure, absolutely.
And that list didn't include any commercial properties whatsoever. So if we did want to include properties in the downtown, that's something that would need to be looked at as well.
So maybe Neil, you should, because I have a comment or a question about that from Michael, but go ahead.
Okay, well, just to clarify this concept of the historic overlay district, when I think of an overlay district, I think of like Crowell Mill, north of Ogden, which has kind of specific boundaries. But what I'm hearing you guys say, I mean, this could be It's all of Hinsdale. There's, there could be homes in southeast, northwest, southwest.
Yep.
So it's not so much a geographic boundary, right?
We have to create the boundaries again for zoning purposes so we can show it on a map, but within that, we have the discretion to determine which houses are actually significant and eligible. So I know it seems odd, but it's something, it's a
Yeah, the
concept
word
we have to
boundary,
do
it's
legally.
it's kind of not exactly a boundary, but,
Right.
yeah, okay.
And the problem is that every significant home might not be a 100-year-old Victorian. As I mentioned in previous meetings up in the Lane School District, there are a few remaining Cronenberg Ranch homes that are very significant from an architectural standpoint that the average person might not realize, but they're 70, 80 years old, and they're significant. And so there'll be some people that'll be surprised, I suspect, when we put our final list together. And we want to kind of mute that surprise and make sure everybody has the educational component firmly in grasp so that people don't overreact to the fact that they've been included in an overlay district. What I'd like to head off would be this mad rush of neighbors coming in here and everybody all upset, like happened with the mistaken language in the moratorium hearings that we had. It upset a lot of people for a lot of the wrong reasons. So I think before we ever really get out to sending those letters within 250 feet, we do our best to give as much publicity and understanding to the general public, so when it does occur, they have some sense of what we're doing and how it might or might not impact them.
Right, I agree, that's gonna be critical. I mentioned maybe public workshops where, the incentives can be explained and questions answered and that
We'd
sort
be
of.
glad to do that as an HPC, as assisting in the educational component. We've had meetings on Saturday mornings, and perhaps as these lists become cast, we can send out invitations to people and let them come and air their thoughts on this stuff so we can head off misunderstandings.
And that's why I think it's important that everybody knows and that we consistently state that it's simply only incentives with no restrictions.
And that participation is completely optional.
So Michael, you were asking earlier about the Central Business District, which of course is the other National Register district that we have in the village. And at our prior HPC meeting, we talked about how we see some value in trying to include the Central Business District in an overlay that has these sorts of incentives. But I guess I wonder from a process standpoint if it makes sense to perhaps move ahead just with the residential component first, or if it makes, I don't know the answer to this, or if it makes more sense to include the CBD from the get-go. I mean, the considerations
One of the
are perhaps
problems is that
different.
perhaps a majority of the buildings in the downtown area are owned by absentee owners. Generational families that have moved out of the area, and I'm not quite sure how we could satisfy the requirements without really brainstorming ownership and notification.
Right, Bethany and I actually talked about how we would frame some of the language in here if we were to allow, because more than likely, if it's a lessee downtown wanting to make the facade improvements or whatever, because they think it will be a benefit to their business, we would have to change some of the wording in here. And I guess as I hear this discussion, I mean, you could start with, here's our set of really historically significant buildings, and a year or two later, if things are going well, you could add another layer to that, whether it's additional residences or the downtown business district. So you don't have to do it all at once.
And that's a good point. As we started this process back in the spring, at least I was looking at it, I thought the process from looking at everything all at once was just too large to take on. And at least I was thinking about it, that we would break it down into several buckets, and at least two of those buckets being residential, have those discussions, craft what is necessary for that, and then separately look at the CBD. and, you know, focus just on that 100%, you know, after we're done with this. Not that we necessarily have to go that way, but at least that's what I envisioned.
I think originally we were thinking that we'd start with the CBD and then go into residential, and now we're flipping this back with the incentive portion of this. And I agree with that. I think we should start with residential from the incentive standpoint, then move to the central business district. But when we get into the Title 14 elements of say the second phase, the codification, Title 14, that we might reverse that order back again.
Yeah, just to second that thought, John, it strikes me that, you know, the HPC has been trying to work towards this goal for several years now. And the sense of urgency is around the residential district. It's not around, the tear downs are not an issue in the central business district. The tear
Correct.
downs are the issue in the residential. So
Correct.
I think we're interested in trying to move.
Yeah, I
There
mean, we're
first.
losing ground daily,
Right.
so we need to concentrate on the residential componentry.
Yeah.
For those of you that might not be aware, I don't, maybe everybody is, but we did manage to save the only Frank Lloyd Wright house in Hinsdale. And it's a great story, and it's a great driver for this type of work that we're doing here now. But
That's fantastic.
And I will say, I've been contacted by 3 or 4 different property owners of people already wanting to be on this list that we don't have, you know, a code for yet. So it is good that I think people are interested in learning more about this and have shown support for it. So I'm sure they'll be coming out if this continues to move forward.
I'd hate to be so optimistic as to say we're turning the tide on the teardown situation, but we'll be restoring 2 major homes in Hinsdale. We restored 6th and Oak, unfortunately due to a fire. But there is a movement that we're seeing to restore the older homes over in the Robbins district and landmark them. So I might remind everybody that back in 2002, when we first embarked upon the landmarking situation, it was very positive. Everybody was for it. It was generally felt that by landmarking your home, you would enhance the value of your home. And then somewhere between the cup and the lip, that got turned 180 degrees, and it became something that was onerous and discouraged, and we found ourselves in this wave of teardowns. But it appears that there's being some good second thoughts on the part of many people. So I'm enthused about that. I don't want to lose the momentum that we've created here governmentally, and that's why this Frank Lloyd Wright saving, which will go on for the next 2-3 years, they're going to forensically deconstruct that house and then construct it back. It'll be landmarked. It'll stand forever as a Hinsdale icon. And we're going to have a public open house on the 7th of November, I believe, Sunday the 7th. Is that correct?
I think it's the 17th.
Yeah, the
7th.
public open house, right. It was going to be October 17th. It was moved to November 7th, I believe.
Yep.
So we hope to get some publicity for that from our local newspaper, and I hope the general public will come out and see the Frank Lloyd Wright House before it becomes deconstructed, and we're going to have events over the next 2.5 years as they work. We're going to have events held at the house to show people how things are done, what these sort of forensic architects do. I mean, this is a big deal. This Gunny Harbaugh, who's doing this, is the #1 guy in the country with the Wright Authority, the Frank Lloyd Wright Authority. So this is a big thing. The eyes will be on Hinsdale, and we have an opportunity here to reverse some of the perceptions that have crept into our world over the last 30 years with teardowns. So I encourage you all to, let's keep our noses to the grindstone and get this work done and get it done correctly, because it's a very good opportunity.
Are
So-
there any other comments?
You know, the only
Questions?
thing, I mean, for this body to start giving thought, should we run through, I guess, some of the we talked about fees, variations. Should we start discussing what people's thoughts are with regard to monies that would be set aside for this? Or is that premature at this point? I think. you know, we need to have the discussion start at some point.
I guess there's two questions, right? One is an overall amount. The other question is for any particular project, you know, is there a cap, and what's sort of the sharing percentage, right?
Yeah. All of the above.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the two biggest financial aspects that would be helpful for staff is, you know, what are people thinking about the property tax rebate portion of it? Obviously, what we put in this ordinance right now as a placeholder text is a percentage of investment. So your minimum investment value for your exterior work would be based on a percentage of your assessed value. So when we started looking at examples, the percentage of an assessed value is going to be, you know, if you did 5% of an assessed value for a smaller lot, smaller house, that's going to be really low versus you have a large home in Robbins, it's a larger house. That's going to be substantially higher. So there's not quite an equal pay between the two of them. So the other option is to just have a minimum amount and just make it flat. Or it could be project by project, or there could be no investment. So we're open to considerations on that.
Yeah, I personally, I wouldn't, it cuts both ways, as you said. I would like to see it as a percent of the investment. So the more work that is done, the more incentivized people are. However, I would hate to get caught with a $5 million renovation in Robbins Park that, you know, saddles us for the long haul. So how is the best way to address that?
Cap it, yeah.
Just cap it.
Just cap it. So what is staff's initial thoughts on what the percentage should be for how long?
And remember, you're only able to rebate the village's
villages.
portion of the property
Right.
tax, so that's kind of a natural cap. They're not gonna get their whole tax bill back.
Yeah, so that was what we looked at of, the real question is how much do you want people to really invest to be able to take advantage of it? And when we did some initial calculations, for example, you know, even a house, a very nice large house in Robbins, their village portion of their tax bill per year is about $2,000. So when you add that on top of a permit fee waiver, and when you add that on top of potentially a grant, it becomes a really great package when you put them all together. But per year basis, someone might be saving $2,000. So we put it, for example, right now in the text at 5 years. So, you know, for the house we looked at, 420 South Park, I think was an example in this packet. I think they would have saved over 5 years, $14,000 when that all played out. And that was an estimate because your assessed value generally goes up every year, so it might have been a little bit more than that, but.
And you can get into the details of all of this, but you can do something as simple as saying, okay, next year we'll allocate $25,000 in the budget, and then we'll see how it all shakes out. Because one of the challenges for staff when I was asking them, well, what number can you go back and look at all the permits? It's kind of hard to do. And I think that we'll be able to refine that number as you see what the asks are. So if they're saying at most it could be $2,000, and if you had 10 homes, and we carry that number for 5 years, and then the real option will be the other amount that's a little bit unknown.
And we've also talked internally about, you know, this is all going to be a first come, first served basis, so maybe we only waive this amount per year. So after we have this many applications approved per year, that's it for this year. You'll have to wait till next year, just to make sure that we're not giving all the taxes away.
And again, as we said, I mean, money's always money. But we're not in a position to give enough money to make the difference to somebody that wants to renovate a house. And so, in my world, it's more demonstrating our attitude as a village, our concern for our heritage, and our ability to work as a governmental body to assist people in expediting the process, the permits, having the ability to get a fast answer, these kinds of things. You can't put a price on that. It's a combination. So to get hung up on the money, I think, is a mistake. I think you need to look at this and say, how many dollars will I allocate to the fund in the first year? and then decide how you want to parcel it out. But really wouldn't get hung up on the money. You don't have enough money to make the difference. You have enough money to put frosting on the cake is what you got.
So do we have any sense of how much money you would allocate the first year, just as a pulling numbers out of the air? I don't know.
Again, we batted around a number of $200,000 last time we sat down here. I don't know whether that's realistic or not. I have no idea what your budget is.
Yeah, I mean, the trustees haven't had any conversation about allocation of resources,
When,
and I think that's one that we need to start considering.
and since we're moving into the budget process, we can certainly go look at that. I think $200,000 might be a little bit steep for our budget, but we can certainly look at that and come up with different scenarios.
I mean, I'm optimistic about this, but I also don't even know if $200,000 would be met the first year. So, I mean, I think we can
You mean demanded, or?
demand,
Yeah,
if the
yeah.
demand would be there.
I doubt it.
Yeah, from a financial perspective, we can take a small step for that first year.
Sure.
And then that gives us a benchmark to measure how we push this going forward, but also how we budget going forward also.
And again, you're the gatekeeper on this. You only have so much money in the fund, so people might say, well, gosh, I'll just wait till next year
Yeah.
before I start. You gotta have drawings, you gotta do all these things anyway. So not, even if you had 10 people that wanted to access this right away, they wouldn't be in a position to come in and get the money because they couldn't show you their plans
And we
and
know
go through
how
all
long
the process.
these
So
projects take a long time.
of course
I
they
can't
do,
imagine
yeah.
that.
Much harder than to build a new house. I mean, by
So,
the time
so similar to how the capital fund works, there's a transfer from the general fund to the capital fund, and then we start with that, and then the balance carries over from year to year. That's perhaps how we could set it up, and then we could get to 1 year, could be a very big project, and then next year we would have to say we don't have the funds and something like that, just have it all work out.
I'd like to just see it
There'll be peaks and valleys, I think, in the
I
program.
agree, and get the program off the ground, and then we can get right into the permitting thing and all that sort of stuff. I mean, that's something we can institute through Rob's department down there, and
Yeah, and just my first reaction, I think 200 may be heavy for the first year too, because what I would hate to see is we go and find $200,000 and then only 15% or 20% of it be used, because then we'll just lose momentum. I'd rather start out at a smaller amount and go from there, but
I think Bethany commented on that, was it Oak Park or someplace that first year didn't use much of the money that they allocated. It's a new program. You know, so I don't think you have to shoot for the moon.
Right.
Yeah, it says here under, you're looking at some of the other communities, for instance, Riverside, a total of $15,000 was budgeted in 2018 for this program. So I don't know what some of these, I don't see numbers for these other
Yeah,
guys.
I mean, I don't see anybody who's putting out $200,000.
That was the number we talked about at our last meeting.
A
Right,
lot of,
right.
Pure conjecture.
Yeah,
for the grants, and most communities that do grants, they do, the typical thing is a 50-50 cost share. And the grants range from $5,000 to $20,000.
Yeah.
And then the board always has discretion. At the end of the year, we have more money. We find this to be a really notable project. They showed us their bills. The costs are higher because it's a larger project. Then there may be more money allocated in certain occasions. But I think 15 to 20 is the general grant amount for most projects that a village would give for one project, unless there's an abnormal circumstance. So that's for the grant portion. Like the property tax rebate, permit fees might be separate. So when you add it all up, it could be a little bit more.
And I think initially, once the program gets kicked in and it gets started, it does take a long time to get these projects drawn up and designed and ready to go. That the first year, we're not gonna need a lot of cash for this.
No.
But the nice part is that I think because these things do take so much time to put together, we're always gonna kind of know what's coming up in the pipeline.
Yeah.
So if we know, hey, we've got 6 houses that are gonna get restored next year, by the time we get to a budget discussion as a village, we can prep for that. Or we can say, hey, you know what, we're not aware of anything coming up next year, and that thing could bounce up and down year to year.
Yeah, and we will be tracking it internally. I mean, it'll grow, we'll know more every year, hopefully.
You mentioned Riverside. I can speak to my experiences with that program. So that money, that 15,000 was allocated for facade improvements for downtown businesses. And what you saw was, the business owner is saying, well, this pot of money is available, I have an opportunity to, replace that sign I've been thinking about and have the village match it 50/50 and get the $2,000 towards my $4,000 project in matching funds. And so you saw them utilize that to make these small improvements that over time kind of create a
Make a
better
difference.
scenario downtown.
Just from a time management standpoint, we're at 7:23. I'd like to end this in 4 to 5 minutes just to give some transition. So we've batted around some numbers. I think trustees need to have, Matt, from your end, you probably need to look and, give some direction to us as like, along with Kathleen, what can we afford? And from my standpoint, I'll have conversations with historic preservation of what do we think is going to be, and staff, what do we think is going to be used, so that next time we meet, perhaps we
Yeah.
can come back with some type of recommendation of what that's going to be.
Yeah, and you were at the revenue assumption meeting a few weeks ago. If there's one year where I don't have a lot of comfort about what the revenues are gonna be next year, like this is the year.
Yeah.
So it's, I guess my thought would be to, keep that number initially, low
Which,
and,
I think what we talked about too, the runway is going to be short the first year because it's going to take a while to get this, so we've got
Right.
that luxury. And then Bethany, in the short time we have, do you want to run through kind of what the next steps in the process, where we stand?
So the next steps, obviously, this is our first draft, so we have a couple of options. We can have a future committee of the whole meetings and talk about some of these ideas moving forward. And then eventually, we'd like to bring this through a formal text amendment process. So that would be everything we've kind of talked about here. It would require a referral, I believe, at the board or, through our normal text amendment process and public hearings at Planning Commission or HPC, so.
Perhaps in this document, we could, I think we should have one more committee of the whole meeting on this, because I'd like to have perhaps they're just yellow highlights in this of what we need to recommend to the Plan Commission to consider. One is gonna be the dollar amount. The other is gonna be how much setback relief do we give, just so that we have all of those variables narrowed down. We've had various conversations as a board and commission about that, but we haven't really had what I would call a meeting of the minds on what those numbers should be. And I think it's important to give the Plan Commission that direction.
And then Michael and I would like to have some extra time to just refine the document a little bit. Like we talked about, there's some definitions we want to go through, references in other code sections, so we need to kind of do a little bit more tweaking too.
Any other thoughts, questions, considerations before we adjourn?
Nice work.
Yeah, good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's a big step forward.
So with that, can I get a motion to close?
So moved.
second.
Roll call?
Trustee Postuma,
Aye.
trustee Harlow,
Aye.
trustee Burns,
Aye.
trustee Banky,
Aye.
chairman Stifler,
Aye.
and how about the HPC? You guys want to adjourn too?
Aye.
Okay.
Aye. You want to think about it?
Thank you.
See you guys.